I'll be comparing Romani families in Germany who are from Pristina, Kosovo, who migrated in 1999 as refugees, so-called, and Roma families in New York from Macedonia who migrated during the last 50 years as labor migrants. And I'll be discussing how cultural expressions of identity change in response to these varied socioeconomic contexts and to migration policy. Community members are making selective choices about ritual, work, language, religion in response to the migrant context. And my analysis illustrates how culture strategically changes in relation to state policy, class, and my emphasis on gendered issues of independence, reproduction, family size, and religion. So in Germany, I'm focusing on Kosovo families who emigrated under dire circumstances during the Yugoslav wars, holding, quote, tolerated status. They are threatened with deportation 20 years after their arrival, despite residence for 2 decades. And economic prospects are bleak, xenophobia is growing, but social welfare is generous. And in tandem, Romani language is thriving, socialization remains insular, and gender roles appear to be very conservative. So I'm examining why this might be and how this is expressed. In contrast, in New York, Macedonian Roma have legal residency. They're more integrated into the workforce. Younger women are advancing in education, becoming more professionally mobile, marrying strategically, having fewer children later in life. So education appears to be a tool for female agency and power and for selected areas of integration, but certainly not assimilation. Romani language is declining, but Macedonian is still spoken regularly. And this is very different than in Germany. In Germany, the focus on the security on the family is embedded in women via ritual. And to me, it seems as if the post-traumatic stress of flight and interpersonal hostilities and medical problems are much more common. So in general, I'm using a new work by Emma Hutchinson that talks about affective communities, how they are distinguished by social forms of feeling that emerge after traumatic events. So I'm claiming that in Germany, ritual interprets migration. Now, there is obviously ritual in both locations, as you'll see, but it means different things and does different types of social work. So in both places, modesty, virginity, religion, music, and dance are bastions of tradition, and in each place, these do contradictory, or you might say multiple types of social work. So let me illustrate the groups one by one. Okay, so Kosovo Roma from the Moravska Mahala there are many others, but the group I'm following is from the Moravska Mahala in Pristina. Ended up in a working class neighborhood in Bremen. Of course, other parts of the family are in other parts of Germany, France, Italy, Belgium, spread out across the entire Western European area. Now, I'm speaking about Romani-speaking families, but obviously this is a larger group identified as RAE, Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians. Ashkali and Egyptians speak Albanian and have a different relationship to policy and even toward repatriation back to Kosovo, because they are less vulnerable when they return to Kosovo than Roma speakers, since they are more Albanian identified. However, I'm speaking about Romani-speaking Roma in Kosovo. Now you have to remember that in Kosovo, many of these Roma had pretty high degrees of education. So they were chemists, they were electrical engineers, some of them were shopkeepers. All women had work in state enterprises, even as cleaning ladies, looked forward to a a pension. So their history is very, very specific. So the migratory history of Roma is about flight during war in a very, very severe phase of the Yugoslav wars, where 2/3 of the Roma population was either internally displaced or fled, and now only 40 to 50,000 remain. Everybody has lost property, everybody is internally displaced. So in Germany, huge numbers of Roma, Ashkali, and Egyptians are registered, and there have been huge numbers of deportations through the years. I mean, it's really, really striking. Children raised in Germany for 15 years have been deported. Let's see if I can give one example here. In 2015, 2 Roma families with a total of 13 children who were in school were deported after 17 years in Germany because, quote, they failed to properly integrate into German society. So the kinds of measures of cultural integration are extremely arbitrary, such as the older generation doesn't speak German perfectly, they're isolated, insular, all of these types of things. So I'm looking at gender because it has actually arisen from the data itself. I am interested in gender, but obviously it has to matter in the data. So first of all, in both Macedonia and in Kosovo, gender is quite complicated on the ground. We're talking about a patriarchal society with many, many areas of female power, including family, income, and decisions about marriage and reproduction and so on. And there are certainly generational differences among these groups, and I'm trying to take an intersectional approach where I see gender as related to class and where ethnicity and race comes in, where Roma are racialized. And that happens in the US as well as Germany. Another area where gender has come up is the actual flight experience of Kosovo Roma, where many men were traumatized or actually absent, and women took charge of the process of getting out of Kosovo overnight. And this involved bribing several mafias, the Albanian mafia, the Montenegrin mafia, the Serbian mafia, the Italian mafia, whatever other mafias were on boats and so on. And many of these women are the caretakers of their family and actually their family's history. So this woman, actually there's 4 generations of this family in Bremen. This woman narrated for about 4 hours to me a story of flight and trauma. And the men in her family, one had a nervous breakdown, another was not present. They really weren't there. So women are quite important. They treasure their older pictures. This is the same woman as an unmarried girl, and through her marriage experience, they treasure their old pictures as artifacts, because she will never go back to Kosovo ever. So Kosovo is a traumatic place for some of these people, and they will not step back. Of course, they do send people back to figure out property and try to get things, but many people will never let their children step back in Kosovo. And they treasure these older items. So the trauma of war and migration, I've narrated this already, where Roma were caught between different warring groups and tried to find a better life and maintain their sanity. They have sleep problems quite a lot. In Germany and other locations, people sleep with lights on all the time at night. So I do identify this as trauma. Another part of the trauma is with the threat of deportation, actually what's going on in Kosovo today. And one thing they talk about is not only property loss and internal displacement, but the poisoning of Roma families in the Mitrovica camp. So even if you're not from Mitrovica, everybody talks about 10 years of Roma living on poisoned camps while the UN watched this and the WHO, World Health Organization, knew all about it, and actually just recently the UN condemned itself for human rights violations. So from 1999 to 2009, you have a generation of lead poisoning. And now Kosovo is a safe country, so deportations are even more likely. So German refugee policy, on the other hand, is quite generous in comparison with other countries, but no work is allowed, and there's an unclear future under this Duldung, or tolerated status. So Duldung means you're sort of a refugee, but you're really not a refugee because you're not working toward permanent residency. You frequently have to register, and different members of the family have to register at different times. So at any weekend, everybody is planning where they have to go to what office at what time to register. So this takes up your entire life. The other thing is that duldung status does not bring a residence permit. It's a sort of, quote, stop on expulsion, according to Claude Cown. And it frequently includes restrictions on freedom of movement. To visit a brother in another city, you may have to get a permit. In order to have certain kinds of health access, you have to get a different kind of permit. And many Roma have been in this status for many, many years. Germany has ruled at certain times certain modifications of this process, so that in terms of employment in 2006, the ruling was that people holding duldung status for more than 6 years could have access to long-term residence permit if they could demonstrate, quote, legitimate employment by 2009, a 3-year period. However, legitimate employment was defined very narrowly. You would have to have, quote, a specific job that matches your professional qualifications, and you have to complete a professional or vocational training that lasts 2 years and that is accredited. So very, very few people can even get into the pipeline for employment. So there are many, many thousands of people in this status. There was an art project that was quite satirical, done by a Bosnian Roma, Nino Pushia, and he called this the deluxe passport, the duldung deluxe passport, meaning it gets you nowhere. It's the opposite of deluxe, and it's a very interesting project. Now, Islam in both Kosovo and Macedonia, Roma formerly were not very religious, but religiosity has grown in Germany and in New York City. In both places, mosque attendance is increasing. A few men have actually gone on the Hajj. Some women are covered, and I've gone to several non-alcoholic weddings. It's more of an extreme, I think, in Germany. For example, many of the religious officials tell them not to celebrate a banquet during circumcision of boys. You do the circumcision, but no party, which is very much not the Balkan tradition, and not to celebrate Herdelezia, spring holiday. In Germany also you have the greater atmosphere of anti-Gypsyism, of media hysteria, of the labeling of poverty migration, bogus cases, fraud. In the East it's much worse, where members of the family I'm working with do live also in the East and report much more tension in terms of racism, demonstrations, and of course this is tied to larger political processes. The newest framework now is even less worthy refugees because there are new refugees, Syrian refugees. So who's more worthy? Angela Merkel is not only retreating on her open door policy, but less and less attention to former refugees. And assaults on refugee shelters averaged 2 per day since 2015. So what I'm arguing is that affective communities are distinguished by these kinds of feelings that emerge after traumatic events, and that Roma retreat into the family and community for security. And these are performative types of ways that Roma make sure that they're still Roma and still okay and still part of their culture and still will survive in the future. And women's performance is extremely important here. So in both places, actually, modesty, virginity, and bride price are embedded, but they mean different things. So for example, when a new bride enters a banquet hall, she's not getting married, but she's a new bride, her modest stance looking down. There are very, very formulaic rituals of how a woman acts in public. The older form of Turkish temana, using your hands to greet the public, has been totally revamped in Kosovo into almost, you might say, dance displays of women using 2 hands, women doing this display in the dance line, 7 or 8 women at a time simultaneously doing this modest woman thing to show that they know their place. These may be women who are managing family budgets and so on. They may have a lot of power, but they're showing that they know what Kosovo Roma modesty is in public. And women are in charge of rituals. They have much more important roles than men, even in a male ritual like a circumcision. They are at the head of dance lines. They're holding the ritual objects. You can see here, for example, a bride from Podujevo, a place that's known for actually very high bride price. Kosovo Roma in Kosovo and still today have a very high bride price. She costs 20,000 euros. And so you can see that if there's a divorce or a separation, there's going to be a huge economic conflict among families that has to be figured out. And this is what Roma are doing. This is what they spent their time doing, figuring this out. So people are leading the dance lines, showing respect, bowing down. There are various kissing rituals and bowing rituals. Respect for elders is coded all the time. Women are dancing with the sieve, which is a fertility symbol. Women decorate a sieve. Now they tend to buy it, but even when they buy it, they redo it at home to show their own feminine talents for ritual objects. This young woman on the left just got married about a month or two ago, actually over the summer, and then ended up with a divorce a month later, and so half of the bride price had to be given back. Very, very complicated economic arrangements. And especially when there are males at the center of ritual, this is really important to the family. So circumcision parties attract many, many people. Any event is not only expensive, but is planned months and months in advance and talked about months and months afterwards. So at a party here in Bremen, you have people from all over Western Europe. This is the way that people gather and remind themselves that something is okay in their lives. Okay, so now I want to switch to Muslim Macedonian Roma in Bronx. And I've worked with them for 30 years, so I actually know a lot about the changes. Yeah, so I'll go through this very quickly. Several hundred families from the 1960s who had a labor migration. And this is still a face-to-face community, but they are also multi-sided. Everybody has relatives in Macedonia, in all of the places I mentioned in Western Europe, Australia, and Toronto, and New York. Their ties to Macedonia are variable because it's expensive to go back, and not everybody is legal, but most people are. But their identities tend to be multiple. They certainly are community members of the Roma community because the Macedonians don't accept them in New York, but they do speak Macedonian and they integrate in the workforce quite a lot. So they embrace US education, which again is not surprising because in Yugoslavia, Roma went to school and did not see school as threatening or anything like that. But women are outpacing men in education and work advancement, which to me is very interesting. And the language is quite different in the States, where Macedonian is spoken, but Romani is declining. There are no Roma organizations and no social welfare. Again, big difference. Islam, though, is growing, but not as much as in Germany. And I want to finish here with some slides to show you the first migrant generation in the 1960s, the places that they live in the first migratory network, which still exists, but people have moved on to middle-class areas. That's actually my house that I grew up in, and I sold it to a Roma family and still visit them, another thing. So no political organizations, but the Islamic centers have become a kind of political organization. They had their first street fair for Eid just a few years ago, and now it's an annual thing. People do travel in the diaspora if they have the money and if they have papers, but it's quite expensive, and some people have never been to Macedonia. Young people have not been to Macedonia. Some people wait years and years for somebody to get a visa to have a double wedding. This wedding had to be postponed for 3-4 years until the father could arrive. These young women are all educated. They do not celebrate International Roma Day. This was a very unusual occasion, but these are all educated people, and you can see they're mostly women. They are in the professions in accounting and so on, clerks, there are school teachers, these 4 educated sisters. Again, the father is invested in them as if one might be a boy, but it doesn't matter in this family anymore. So tremendous change in the last 20 to 30 years about female independence. Many of the young men are not being educated because they don't have the same restrictions as women. They're out in the street a lot. Many of the young men do get involved in drug trade or some kind of even gangs, but the women have more restrictions because they are told you have to come home right after school and you have domestic. So it turns out that the duties of the women actually contribute to later education and independence. Educated young men have told me that it's their parents who told them the same thing as their daughters, but they didn't listen. But now that they are educated, they realize how important it is for their sons to be educated. And so because we don't have state daycare or even cheap daycare, people rely on elders. So elders are still in traditional roles. I followed focus groups of unmarried young women as they talked about who they might marry, when they might marry, and then how it actually panned out. And in this group of, actually it was 5 women, all of them ended up marrying Roma from Macedonia or neighboring regions, but Roma. Even though they narrated to me earlier that they just want a supportive male, a male who will support their roles and also be build a secure role for their family. But all of them ended up marrying Roma men. So these young girls meet at weddings. At these events are where they get together, although now there is certainly Facebook and all kinds of other things, but not really dating like in the American style. So here's one of them with a celebration of virginity. And I'll just end here talking about sexuality a little bit. In both locations, there still is a test of virginity. And this was surprising to me in New York because with such independence of women, I really expected at least the younger generation to be questioning this. Now, they say that the test of virginity marks them apart from Americans, where there's unbridled sexuality and people who are, they point to Hispanics, other racialized people in their neighborhoods who are having babies at 14, but they don't, okay? Because they know more about sexuality and they wait, and they are waiting longer, and they keep their virginity intact. And virginity is celebrated publicly, not so much like in Macedonia showing the sheet, although there have been instances of a sheet being FedExed from Toronto to Bronx, New York, so that the mother-in-law would be able to see it, because people can't cross borders, they don't have they don't have documents, but the sheet has to be there. But it's celebrated publicly in events, blaga rakia, that are known to, indicate that virginity exists. Of course, there's lots of ways to get around these tests. Many women told me lots of stories of having the test of virginity on their own territory with their own women. So there's certainly ways to mediate whether something can go wrong. Even if a woman is a virgin, things could go wrong. So she has to figure out how to make sure this procedure has a good outcome. And music is a central focus of the community in both places. But what I'm arguing is that in New York, it is basically to distinguish distinguish themselves from Americans and to remind themselves of their diasporic identity. Whereas in Germany, we're really dealing with a traumatic situation that has to do with affect and insecurity. So I'll just end here showing you a few of these pictures. In the actual rituals, things operate pretty much the same. The order of the dance line is important, tipping and so on, and displays of what I would call extreme emotion, that is visceral emotion is very important. But the last thing is that in America, American customs are now incorporated into rituals, so that a girl's first birthday, when a girl graduates college, there's a huge banquet that looks like a wedding, but it's actually honoring a girl's educational achievement. Bridal showers are now in banquet halls using the gift wrapping on their heads like Americans do. Okay, well, thank you very much.